Some people say there is a new sun every day, that it begins its life at dawn and lives for one day only. They say you have to make the sun happy. You have to make a good day for it. You have to make a good world for it.
It was so glorious out in the country. It was summer, the cornfields were yellow, the oats were green, the hay had been put up in stacks in the green meadows. All around the fields and meadows were great forests, and in the midst of these forests lay deep lakes. Oh yes, it was glorious out in the country.
In 1 century, we have grown from being a society that fears and destroys wilderness to one trying desperately to preserve what wilderness remains. Why? The story of this change is the story of Ontario's provincial parks. Park, a place set aside, enclosed. In the beginning, parks were large gardens. Wilderness lay beyond their walls and fences. Today, much of Ontario's wilderness lies inside park boundaries.
What would the world be once bereft of wet and wildness? Oh, let them be wildness and wet. Long live the weeds and the wilderness yet.
Before we had parks, or any need for parks, people lived close to this land for thousands of years. Some say 12,000 years. Some say 40,000. No matter where you go in Ontario, Temagami, Missinaba, Mazenod, Serpent Mounds, Awenda, you will find that others were here long before you. In ecological terms, the hunting and gathering way of life is the most successful ever practiced. The first people knew and respected the land. They cherished practices which helped to keep it healthy. They had no word for park, because for them, all earth was a park, to be carefully looked after. All lives were important. The lives of trees, the lives of rocks, the lives of rivers.
This rock is not a tomb to be pried open, a difficult treasure chest needing a key, but the treasure itself, giving itself away. It is a way of seeing, of remembering, of changing your mind. The jagged wall of rock is not a wall, but a doorway, a way through.
Never a day passes but that I do myself the honor to commune with some of nature's varied forms. If you love it enough, anything will talk with you.
Here in Ontario, this way of seeing the land began to change in the 17th century with the arrival of newcomers. Coureurs de bois, the first traders called themselves, woods runners. There weren't many at first, and they lived much as people had always lived in Ontario. Traveled the same rivers, ate the same food, slept on the same beaches. But they brought new things, new tools and trinkets, and new diseases. Close behind them came the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company, interested only in the wealth to be made from furs. To get that wealth, they organized both the land and the people in the only way they knew, mathematically. The voyageurs were key to that organization. They were strong and young and boisterous. They carried immense loads on the portages and sometimes died beneath them. They also died in rapids. Across Georgian Bay and Lake Huron, across Lake Superior, down the Albany and Missinaba rivers, to this day the main highways and the parks of Ontario lie along their old routes, once the native trade routes before them. Fitzroy, Mattawa, Pancake Bay, Samuel de Champlain, French River, Agawa, Quitico, 40 provincial parks are on the old fur trade routes. They're windows on the past, those parks. The land is preserved in them much as it was when the voyageurs swept through. In any of them, you don't have to paddle very far before you journey into the past. And then, out of time itself. Even before the fur traders had finished with the land, others were moving in search of other fortunes. White pine.
Come on, you jolly fellows, and listen to my song. It's all about the shanty boys and how they got along. We're the jolliest bunch of fellows that ever you could find. The way we spend our winter months is running down pine.
In one 14-year period at the turn of this century, 16 billion board feet of white pine fell in Ontario, enough lumber to build a boardwalk 18 inches wide around the equator. Within 3 generations, most of southern Ontario had been changed from forest to farmland. They believed in progress. They believed they were improving the land and that the bounty of earth was unlimited. But wilderness is always the antagonist. Wilderness must always be tamed. Some began to ask, tamed for what? Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, there were other voices that spoke for the wild and its creatures. Some were poets.
Now I see the secret of the making of the best persons. It is to grow in the open air and to eat and sleep with the earth.
Some were philosophers.
Every part of nature teaches that the passing away of one life is the making room for another. The oak dies down to the ground, leaving within its rind a rich virgin mold, which will impart a vigorous life to an infant forest. Every tree sends its fibers forth in search of the wild. The city's imported at any price. Men plow and sail for it. From the forest and wilderness come the tonics and barks which brace mankind. In wildness is the preservation of the world.
An ancient earth wisdom had survived despite civilization. As the destruction of the wilderness accelerated in North America, Those who had inherited that wisdom began to influence public policy. One of the first signs of that influence was the demand for large parks. On April 23, 1887, the first public park in Ontario was set aside here, at the place whose name means the thunder of water. Niagara. It was Shakespeare's birthday. No dignitary read his poetry at the opening ceremony, but if they had done so, it might have been the good advice of Caliban.
Be not afeard. The isle is full of noises, sounds, and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not.
People in Ontario were growing less afraid of wilderness, finding in it beauty and health. They were learning that wilderness wasn't for anything except itself. To some, this was a startling and irreligious idea, that not all parts of Earth were for human use. Yet when the government began to consider the formation of a new park at the headwaters of several rivers, a huge park larger than Prince Edward Island, that idea was present in their thinking.
It is time we understood that the cry, clear the forest, make the woodland into farms, has no application to the great stony granitic pine-covered belt which hems our more fertile region. That is for forest, and in forest forever it should remain.
In 1890, a civil servant named Alexander Kirkwood recommended that the park be created and named Alangquin.
To honor one of the greatest Indian nations that has inhabited the North American continent.
The park would protect the vital watersheds of the region. To the east, the Petawawa and the Madawaska. To the west, the Ox Tongue and all its tributaries. Alangquin Park is a vast reservoir, gathering its life in myriad secret places. Kirkwood was also concerned about animals. Hunting and trapping had already endangered many species in the region, and in his opinion, these species needed a refuge. Alangquin National Park, soon renamed Alangquin Provincial Park, was created
as a public park and forest reservation, fish and game preserve, health resort, and pleasure ground for the benefit, advantage, and enjoyment of the people of the province.
In hindsight, we can see what a remarkable accomplishment that was. Kirkwood and the legislators preserved part of what we now call an ecosystem. They themselves had no word for what they'd saved. No word, that is, except park. They helped to preserve an idea also, an idea shared by millions of Canadians. This was the idea of North. The notion that there would always be wilderness, a natural regulator at the heart of this country. People visit Alangquin today to see and feel that wilderness and to draw health from it.
Bobby, what are you going to do with the big one?
From the beginning, there was controversy. The timber barons who had cleared the white pine from eastern Canada also wanted the great stands of the Mattawa and Madawaska. There would be no park without logging. Immediately after the park was set aside, the J.R. Booth Lumber Company built the Canada Atlantic Railway through it. Park Superintendent Peter Thompson, Canoe Lake, October 1893.
The Gilmore Company built a lumber camp within 10 or 12 feet of our headquarters. They also entered the grove and took out the pine, at the same time cutting down a great number of other trees and marring the beauty of the place, which I had hoped to preserve.
Well, when the drive's nearly over, they like to go down and watch all the lads as they work on the ribbon. When evening comes around, they'll all be in town and they'll all want to walk with their dog fight. For he goes burning down, down the white water. That's where the log driver learns that life they burn down, down the white water. Log drivers walk these girls. Michael! Yahoo! To please both their parents, had to give way and dance with the doctors, the lawyers, and the merchants, even the park superintendents.
Algonquin was serving its purpose as a forest and game preserve, but citizens were not yet coming for recreation. In 1895, only 38 people had camped in Algonquin Park, and by the beginning of World War I, it was still rarely visited.
Alangquin Park is chiefly enjoyed by American visitors and a few eccentric artists and nature lovers from Toronto.
Some of those eccentric artists, however, would help to change forever the way we looked at wilderness and our ideas about its value. Dr. J.M. McCollum.
Tom Thomson painted not merely to paint, but because his nature compelled him to paint, because he had a message. The North Country gradually enthralled him, body and soul. He began to paint that he might express the emotions the country inspired in him, all the moods and passions, all the somberness and the glory of color.
Thompson in his canoe, with fish line and sketch box, paddling along a shoreline looking for something to paint, somewhere to make camp for a night or a week, is a picture to remember of a pioneer who was an artist, and that is a rare combination in our national story.
Most Ontarians, however, would never see the northern parks or forest reserves. In the early years of this century, they had neither the money nor the time to travel long distances for holidays. They worked 6 days a week, 10 hours per day, and most families needed not one, but two incomes. For them, a long journey by rail to Algonquin Park was out of the question. They needed parks closer to home, in southern Ontario. Here at Rondo, shifting sandbars curve into Lake Erie to embrace one of the finest natural harbors on the Great Lakes. In the 18th century, the British Navy used this anchorage and felled the great stands of pine for masts and spars. When the Erie and Huron Railroad arrived in 1883, Rondo became a prime tourist area. Hotels and cottages sprang up around the shore. Steamers from Erie and Cleveland brought thousands of visitors on summer weekends. Residents soon understood that if the land was not to be destroyed, it had to be protected. They petitioned their members of the legislature, and in May 1894, 1 year after the creation of Algonquin, Ontario had another major provincial park. Once again, those who made the park had preserved more than they realized. Like Long Point and other Lake Erie parks, Rondo was very different from Algonquin. Trees rare in Ontario grow here: tulip trees, and sassafras, and eastern red cedars. 125 of the rare plants in Ontario are preserved in Rondo. From the beginning, Rondo Park was vigorously defended by local citizens who protested against the removal of trees, even dying ones. But although they could halt logging, they could not stop holidayers, or the attempt by park managers to be all things to all people. Rondo soon became an amusement park with a dance pavilion, a shooting gallery, shuffleboard and tennis courts, miniature golf, pony rides, and zoos for exotic animals. The problems multiplied. A pair of deer brought from Alangquin escaped from their compound into the park's lush forests. By 1909, there were 150 of them. By 1912, nearly 400. Waterfowl became an important source of revenue for the new park. Sportsmen from across Ontario and the States paid well for a few hours in Rondo's broad marshes. It was good business. But was it good use? Good conservation? There was also money in genteel recreation. The end of the century was the age of gracious resort hotels. The Highland Inn opened in 1908, the Pneumagen, the Minising, and Mowat Lodge in 1913. Similar hotels flourished throughout Ontario, many in prime locations that are now provincial parks. Wasaga Beach, Silent Lake, Presqu'île, Point Farms, Bon Echo.
They say, if you visit West Point at Sandbanks on a warm summer's eve and listen carefully above the pounding of waves, you can still hear the gentle tapping of croquet mallets on well-manicured lawns, the clang of the old dinner bell on the lodge veranda, and the laughter of children playing hide-and-seek.
In 1905, the government began to lease Algonquin land for cottages. Soon after, it opened the park to youth camps. Managing the parks was becoming a big and complex business. How should they be used, and for whose benefit? What should parks be for? At the end of World War I, prosperity, longer vacations, and the automobile meant more demands on parks. What were all these people looking for? Something they didn't have at home. Some peace and quiet. A little space. A bit of the great wilderness they knew lay far to the north. They couldn't reach the wilderness in Alangquin, at least not easily. Ontario built 320 kilometers of highway every year during the 20s, but only the railroad passed through Algonquin Park. Cottagers were so vehemently opposed to a 1930 highway plan that a frustrated government considered abolishing the park altogether. 3 years later, faced with the closing of the railway and the loss of access to their cottages, the leaseholders asked for the road. When it was completed in 1935, 1,600 vehicles entered Algonquin Park. In 1936, the total was over 3,000. In 1938, 6,000. By 1939, Ontario had 7 large parks: Alangquin, Rondo, Quitico, Presqu'île, Ipperwash. For 5 years, there would be no more. From the Second World War, we learned that we could destroy all life. We also relearned a lesson we had begun to forget: that to believe we could control nature was a dangerous illusion.
civilized, crying to be human again. This will tell you how. Turn outward, love things, not men. Turn right away from humanity. Let that doll lie. Consider if you like how the lilies grow. Lean on the silent rock until you feel its divinity. Make your veins cold. Look at the silent stars. Let your eyes climb the great ladder out of the pit of yourself and man.
At the end of the war, more leisure time, the 2-week vacation, and a higher standard of living once again increased the demand for more parks and more knowledge. In response to this need, the government introduced naturalist programs in Alangquin. They proved so popular that they were soon begun in other parks as well. During the 1940s and 50s, strong conservation organizations like the Federation of Ontario Naturalists began to influence government policy. They wanted more wildlands preserved. Sanctuaries, they were called. Not sanctuaries for 1 or 2 species only, but for all.
There is real danger that overemphasis upon the conservation of a particular species may prove detrimental to the preservation of nature as a whole. The need for nature preservation does not depend only on the economic value of natural life.
In 1944, much of the eastern shore of the Great Freshwater Sea became Lake Superior Park. The new park included mouths of rivers that had flowed for millennia off the Shield, creating splendid beaches, the Gargantua, the Sand, the Agawa.
The great sea has sent me adrift. It moves me as the weed in a great river. Earth and the great weather move me, have carried me away, and move my inward parts with joy.
Also in 1944, Sibley Provincial Park, now Sleeping Giant, was set aside. In these 2 parks, one on the east shore and one on the north, the people of Ontario for the first time owned land bordering a great wilderness of water. Once again, we had preserved more than we understood. And in some degree, in protecting wilderness, we had ourselves escaped the bounds of time. But the questions remain. What should parks be for? Should they be just for wild creatures? Just for recreation? Could one park serve several uses? The idea of north was more popular than ever. The pressures on parks and governments increased. From 1950 to 1954, the number of cars entering Alangquin Park almost doubled, as did the number of cottage leases. In the 5 years from 1956 to 1961, use increased 300%. On long weekends in 1963, 30,000 people had to be turned away. No one doubted that Ontario needed more parks, many more. And in the 50s and 60s, the Parks Branch created them, some of the most famous parks in the system.
Pinery, Sibbald Point, Serpent Mounds, Wasaga Beach, Killbear, Darlington, Batchewana, Inverhuron, Lake of the Woods, Kettle Lakes, Lake Nipigon, Killarney, Naze, Kakabeka Falls, Earl Row, Sauble Falls, Mississauga, Point Farms, Sioux Narrows, Kapkigawan.
From 1950 to 1970, almost 100 parks came into being, an average of 5 per year. A new way of classifying parks also emerged. Many parks were considered large enough to accommodate several uses. In them, administrators tried to regulate conflicting uses, like logging and canoe tripping, or bird watching and hunting.
With due regard for their order of importance in the public interest.
In the mid-60s, however, this multiple-use policy was in trouble. Too many people wanted to use the parks in too many ways. Many were no longer islands of peace. In Alangquin, campsites were seriously overcrowded and sometimes polluted. In Killarney, cans and bottles littered the portages and garbage piled up on campsites. In Sibbald Point, Wasaga Beach, Rondo, and Pinery, family campers were often shaken by rowdyism. Throughout the 60s, concern for the environment rose dramatically. We knew that we were consuming resources at an unsustainable rate. We knew that we were endangering many species, and that pollution was making Earth unfit even for human habitation. And we knew that our ability to preserve wilderness could be a major test of our fitness as a species. We must learn restraint. We must learn again to let wilderness be. It was a lesson reinforced by Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac.
We abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect.
Then, in 1968, Ontario created its first primitive park, Polar Bear, an area almost as large as Scotland, sprawling across the tundra at the mouth of the Winisk River. For the first time in Ontario, a government had moved to protect a wilderness, acknowledging as it did so the psychological need to know that unspoiled wilderness areas exist. The idea of North, the place beyond our reach.
We can never have enough of nature. We must be refreshed by the sight of inexhaustible vigor. We need to witness our own limits transgressed and some life pasturing freely where we never wander.
In Polar Bear Park, we confirmed the right of other creatures, snow geese, caribou, seals, Arctic foxes, and wolves, to live in harmony. We acknowledged the importance of the infinitely subtle relationships among them. This was a significant change. We discovered that we could see beyond the short-term gain. We discovered that our institutions could adapt to ecological facts. Polar Bear Park became a symbol of profound hope for conservationists, and it was soon followed by another, the designation of Quitico as a protected wilderness.
How often we speak of the great silences of wilderness, and of the importance of preserving them and the wonder and peace to be found there. When I think of them, I see the lakes and rivers of the north. They will always be there, and their beauty may not change. But should their silences be broken, they will never be the same.
When Quitico Park was created in 1913, lumbering was a major industry. The park had been created to prevent poaching, not to protect trees. Nor were tourists encouraged in those early years. In fact, in 1944, the district forester urged that Quitico be stripped of its park status, arguing that it had no recreational value for Canadians. A few years earlier, the Canadian writer Gregory Clark had written to an American friend,
You cannot expect from the Canadian public anything like the response in the United States because you've suffered and lost so much of your wilderness, and we're merely in the process of losing it.
But in 1946, largely through the work of American conservationists, logging was halted in this Ontario park. For 20 years, there would be no more cutting. Then, in the late 60s, the government divided Quitico between two companies, granting licenses to build the networks of roads which cutting operations required. By 1969, many jobs already depended on these operations. In 1970, images from a Wildlands League protest against clear-cutting shocked citizens in southern Ontario. They had thought that Quitico, because it was a park, was already a protected wilderness. They had found ruined forests deeply offensive. Their idea of North was being violated. In June 1973, the minister announced that Quitico would be reclassified. There would be no more multiple use. Quitico would stay wild. Again, the people of Ontario had made a choice. They had served notice that they valued wilderness and wanted it kept. They had moved to a new kind of ethics, an ethics that included non-human lives, other animals, plants and trees, rocks and rivers. In Quitico, we admitted the limitations of knowledge and of progress. We did not lose faith in science and technology, but we regained faith in something else. We were beginning to think, as Albert Einstein said, in a radically old way. Land had grown expensive in southern Ontario, but by 1970, after a decade of urban upheavals, governments understood the importance of parks in filling profound emotional needs. Once again, the Parks Branch responded.
Owenda, Bronte Creek, Port Burwell, McRae Point, Forks of the Credit, Pretty River Valley, Monocliffs, Boyne Valley, Halfway Lake, Murphy's Point, Middle Falls, Nemagusenda River.
Some parks are intended purely for recreation. These have a good beach, hiking trails, and sites where campers can spend a night or an entire vacation. Others are rivers, and still others, nature reserves, are intended to protect unusual geological features or the habitats of rare species. Ojibwe Prairie, inside the city limits of Windsor, is a rare mix of 533 flowering plants, 60 of them typical of the vegetation that once covered the western plains. At Montreal River, 75 meters above Superior, a nature reserve protects the lichens on the rolling beaches of lakes that receded 6,000 years ago. High on the cliffs above Lake Mazenod grow cedars 300 years old. And here, in Wilmette Canyon, are subarctic plants deep in the coolness at the base of cliffs where few will visit. Others, such as Michipicoten and the Teaching Rocks, protect important historical sites. More wilderness parks followed Quitico: Lady Evelyn Smoothwater, Kesagami, Wabakimi, El Pasquia, Slate Islands, and Woodland Caribou. Killarney, long a favorite among Canadian painters, was set aside as wilderness in 1971. At the end of the 1980s, Ontario had 260 parks, covering an area larger than Nova Scotia. They lie in 5 ecological zones, from the tallgrass prairie and Carolinian forest in the south, through the Great Lakes and boreal forests, to the tundra in the north. And they preserve a remarkable diversity of life. Over 5,000 species of plants and animals. 100 years, 260 parks. They're beyond value, these parks. We have protected them from the worst in ourselves for the best in ourselves. The wilderness in them permits us to be at ease with a harmony we do not understand. Perhaps this legacy, these places free from time, will help us to shape a world in which we no longer need a word for park, because we shall respect all lives and the mystery we share.
We are of the earth and belong to you, O Mother Earth, from whom we receive our food. You care for our growth, as do our own mothers. Every step that we take upon you should be done in a sacred manner. Each step should be done as a prayer.